In this video, I'm going to go over those three derivation problems I recommended you try at the end of the video lesson 5.2, Introducing Subderivations. Remember, this video is going to be most useful to you if you've tried those problems on your own first. You don't technically have to watch this, so I do recommend you trying those problems and then watching it if that's something you want to do. But of course, you're welcome to just look at it to get some more experience watching problems being done. I'm only going to go over those three derivation problems where you are required to construct derivations. That's page 166, 2E, G, and I. I'm not going over those problems that just had you fill in justifications on completed derivations. So let's get started. The first problem was this 2e on page 166. You have to derive b from these three premises. It's not the case that, if it's not the case that b, then c. It's not the case that c, if and only if a, and a. So we know we're trying to derive b, and we don't really have any way to get to that directly. So I'm going to start by assuming the negation of b as a premise for negation elimination. Remember, when we're using one of the negation rules, elimination or introduction, what we're doing is assuming the opposite of what we're trying to get. In this case, we're trying to get b with no negation attached. So we assume the opposite by adding that negation. And we need a contradiction in here so that we can get b out on our main scope line. So let's start working towards getting that contradiction. We know we can get c because we have the negation of b, which is the antecedent of premise 1. If it's not the case that b, then c. So now we need to try to get a contradiction. We can try to get not c, right? We have not c in premise 2, which we can get through biconditional elimination with a, which is premise 3, and that biconditional on premise 2. So this one's really quick. You might, if you did this problem on your own, have reiterated both the biconditional from line 2 and a from line 3 inside this subderivation. That is perfectly okay and a good idea as you're first beginning to work these problems. I didn't do it in this case. We were allowed to use this rule right here on line 6. So then on line 7, now that we have that contradiction inside the subderivation, we can close that subderivation in that line and discharge it, and discharge this premise using that negation elimination rule. And again, the line reference that you use here is for that whole subderivation from lines 4 through 6. The next problem is kind of similar, right? We're trying to get the negation of h from these two premises. We have if h, then I, and it is not the case that I. So I'm going to take a similar strategy. I'm going to assume h, which is the opposite of the conclusion we're trying to get. In this case, it's a premise for negation introduction, right? We're trying to add a negation onto h when we discharge that premise. And here our contradiction is pretty clear, right? We have if h, then I, and now on line 3 we have h. So we can get I via conditional elimination from 1 and 3. And again here, you likely reiterated from line 1 on line 4 and then did this step on line 5. That is absolutely okay to reiterate those in. I would encourage you to do that as you're practicing. But because we're only moving in across scope lines, it's okay for us to just use this rule like I've done on line 4. And now we need to finish our contradiction. We see we have I, and we have it's not the case that I on line 2. So we can reiterate that in and have it's not the case that I on line 5. And remember, it's important that you reiterate that in. Even though you can see the contradiction by having I on line 4, and it's not the case that I on line 2, to use the negation, introduction, or elimination rules, you have to have that contradiction inside that scope line. So it was important for us to make sure we reiterated the negation of I here. And again, that lets us use the rule, right? We've assumed the opposite of what we want to get, and we've proved a contradiction from it. So on line 6, we can use negation introduction to add a negation to H. And again, we cite that whole subderivation, in this case, lines 3 through 5. All right, and this last problem, we're trying to derive it is not the case that F or G. Here we don't have a clear way of just getting F or G, so I'm going to do the same thing again. Yes, this lesson is making sure you know how to use those negation rules, because we're trying to get the negation of that whole disjunct, right? That negation is outside of those parentheses. We can assume F or G as a premise for negation introduction. And now we need to try to get a contradiction. The first thing I'm going to do is use conditional elimination, right? F or G is the antecedent that I have here on that conditional on line 1. So I can get the consequent H and I via conditional elimination from 1 and 3. So now we can start seeing where we're going to get our contradiction, right? We have H and I, so we know we can get H by itself using conjunction elimination from line 4. And then again, just like the previous problem, we can get the negation of H, reiterating it from line 2 as it's there as our second premise. And then we can discharge that premise now that we have the contradiction inside there, inside that subderivation, and get it is not the case that F or G from negation introduction from that whole subderivation on lines 3 through 6. Now these problems were pretty simple, pretty short, pretty straightforward. The next video lesson is going to start getting into more complex derivations where you have more than one subderivation inside each other. You should go ahead and watch that lesson if you haven't already, as we're going to be working with more complex subderivations in class. And I will also do a review video for the assigned problems with that I give the recommended problems that I give you at the end of that video.